let's hear it from you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi. Everybody. So I'm going to start with the thing that I've been asked most often when I've been interviewed by adoptees or a podcast or such, or maybe they've waited a while before they ask me, but how can you, being an adoptee, relinquish your own baby? So it's actually what you mentioned is it's the normalization of, and also it's very much the narrative of adoption, especially when I was adopted. I was adopted out of Canada in 1957, out of an indigenous home, placed in a white home. My parents were living in Alaska. They were older, 32 and 42, and had gone to Alaska to start something new. So I was told as I was growing up, you know, early bedtime stories, how I was special, that my other mother loved me so much that she wanted me to have a mommy and a daddy, that she was selfless, and that I was lucky and a gift. And so that's the narrative that was, and I believe today as well, it's also society's narrative. And I think that's one of the hardest things about getting the public as a whole to understand adoption, because they've never felt this. They've never lived with, and in fact, I didn't know that I didn't have identity. I didn't know that I was, that I had pre-verbal trauma. I didn't know any of those things. I just had this lived experience that I had nothing to compare it to. So, and of course, when I'm 15, I had also a lot of trauma at home. So my adoptive parents should probably have never been parents. And they had their own intergenerational trauma. My mother's parents were raging alcoholics. She used to ride in the rumble seat through the windy roads from Reno to Virginia City so that in case they crashed while they were insanely drunk, she wouldn't be an orphan and she could die with them. So that created a very codependent mother, very hypervigilant and overprotective. And then we adopted my brother out of Canada 3 years later. Now I'm like my dad used to call me, my father used to call me a little percheron. I was this tough little, like the horses that are real sturdy, you know, and I was a tomboy and I appeared very strong. And my brother was very needy. He was high need, he was skinny, he needed fattening up. And my mother was a caretaker. So when we got my brother, in fact, my mother and brother, I remember in the 90s when I was sitting and talking to them about some of the stuff I was working through, and I was in therapy, and she kind of made a joke about how funny it was that when they were walking out of the foster home holding my 3-week-old brother, and I looked up in absolute horror, realizing that I'd been replaced. So there's another trauma, and certainly there was, because that's when my father swooped in and realized, you know, that I was fair game. And so I grew up, and my father, what I didn't realize at the time until I had this relationship with a man a number of years ago, he love bombed me. So I am really susceptible to love bombing. I mean, if I'm love bombed, I feel loved. I feel like I'm important and needy as I am for love and attention. And so my dad used to say how strong I was, and I was special, and I was, you know, sweetheart, and all these things, along with this sexual abuse that was going on, that most of which I repressed, thank God. So I had this really dysfunctional family, obviously, you can see that. My mother was jealous of me because of my father, and I know today that she probably knew what was going on, but had this built-in survival strategy of denial. That's how she survived. And I adapted that same denial. And I didn't realize how I adapted that. And it's evolved over time, in that when I started writing my memoir in 2016, and my daughter, my kept daughter, and it's interesting because she was always the daughter I got to keep. That's always how I referred to her. And so now it's a term, kept daughter. And she was pregnant with my grandson, who's now 8 years old. She said, Mom, you should write a memoir. This is so fascinating. You were adopted, and then you had a baby and gave her up for adoption, and you found your family, and you found Mary, and it's just, people will be fascinated. And it wasn't that I wanted to write about. It was the other stuff that I knew didn't sit right, that I couldn't quite grasp. And a lot of that had fog connotation, for sure, and also the abuse and many, many other things that I really, through writing this, and I worked with a developmental editor. She was a nonfiction developmental editor, which I didn't even know what that was because I had ADD and cheated all through school and cut class. So I was uneducated, and I would write, and she would send her parts of it, and she'd give me developmental feedback, dig here, show, what do you mean you felt shame? Show me what, and I'd never thought about why I felt shame. So when I was 13, 11, 13, 14, and 15. At 11, my father approached me with some very disturbing conversations. It's in the back of my book. It's the teaser chapter to my next book, which I couldn't put it all in one book, right? And then I had a car ride with my father at 13 where it was extremely traumatic and abusive, and I today really think he probably took me to a whorehouse. And I have so many repressed memories, but I have flashes of memory, right? And then I was severely beaten with a wire hanger at 14, and my mother let him do it, and I had no one to clean my wounds. And I repressed much of that, and I found that out, that I had scars on my back, that I had bleeding on my back, and I don't remember the back at all. I still to this day, as my girlfriend told me after I was writing, and I called her, she was in Alaska still, and I'd moved to California, and she said, Mom, Monica, I couldn't believe you had open wounds on your back. And I still don't remember those. So that was at 14, and then how I survived this very constrictive home, because I'm indigenous. I mean, I have 29% indigenous DNA on both sides of my family, and my people are all free-spirited in Canada, because this is where I was adopted. And I am a free spirit. I don't want to be tethered. Even today with the work that I do, I make my own hours. It's always been like that. And so I snuck out my bedroom window to have this freedom that I craved. And of course I got into really difficult situations, because Alaska, back in the 70s, was oil boom era, where you had human trafficking, you had massage parlors on almost every corner, you had all this money was flowing in, you had 2 bases, you had very wealthy people coming into town, executives for the oil industry, and then you had the Hells Angels and all the stuff that happened up there. And so I was 15, and the thing that I had for my identity, because I didn't know this at the time, because I was very not self-aware at all, is that I had no identity. And so because of this Madonna weird stuff in my family, the Catholic stuff that my father groomed us with, is that I was gonna be this badass virgin. And I was going to be the worst juvenile delinquent I could be, because then I'd have somebody look up to me. So what I did is I sought lower companions to feel like somebody. I didn't fit with the smart kids, I didn't fit anywhere. And so I had this, Monica Hall, the badass version, is gonna kick your ass in Anchorage, and I was 103 pounds and 5'2". And I did those things, and I did a lot of damage up there. But what I did is I snuck out my window at 15 and got raped by a 19-year-old heroin addict. And I had to tell my parent, well, they told me because she had taken me to the doctor. I didn't know you could get pregnant that way. I was so naive, you know, about sex. And my mother screamed at me when I got home, Monica, you're pregnant. And of course I would never tell anybody what happened because I still felt it was my fault. I didn't scream, I didn't have a bloody nose, you know, all those things again that society thinks it's somebody in a dark alley. And I didn't want to tell my parents. I snuck out my window, and I knew they would have humiliated me and everybody would have known in Anchorage. And so what they did back then is they put you in a house or in a pregnant girls' school, and they gave me the option, but I decided to stay home. So the doors were locked. If I left the house, I had to go through the garage and get in the car and drive. You know, I had to sit in the car when my mom went to the store. And my mom bought me a journal. And so that was my solace. And I kept a journal through this whole thing. So fast forward, I did reunite with my daughter, and it's a very interesting, this generational trauma. And even the daughter that I got to keep, she and I both have a phobia. And it's called a metaphobia. It's a fear of vomiting. And mine started when I was, I had an episode with my father that I do remember, and I was about 6. And hers started with a similar episode when she was sexually abused at 5. And so this was a trigger that happened, and a fear of toilets overflowing. Both of us had this horrible fear, and we went into therapy at that time, and that's when I started realizing I'd had other things, and that's when the healing really started. But I had dealt with my trauma by drugs and alcohol in my 20s, and I got sober at 26, so I've been sober for 40 years now. So that's been a really long journey to a healing, right? So there's been all these steps, and then the writing was like, it was so impactful because there's so much I didn't understand, and it was so interesting because I think part of it was I really wanted to understand why that girl at 13 hurt people. Because after I'd had that abuse, you know, and had the baby, I was a changed person. I mean, if I was a narcissist and a sociopath before, which I probably was, there was a major shift because I identified with people that had been hurt. And so when I was in the hospital, and this is where it was very hard to unwind while writing, because there was never a choice about relinquishment in my family. I was taken to a nun who was a social worker who was gonna find the baby and be my friend, find the parents and be my friend. And I loved her, she was my friend, but I knew she wanted to take my baby. So there was this, you know, I never really had anybody that I could talk to. I didn't have my mom, my parents, I had no friends. You know, there was just nobody that I could be honest with, and I could have told her all the things that was going on at home. I was just full of secrets, and you're only as sick as your secrets. So the writing, I went through all of this with this developmental editor and back and forth for 7 years. And I was able to see, and it wasn't until this 2023, the end of 2023, when I was finishing it, I had a girlfriend come over, and she had lost her mother. Her mother committed suicide from addiction, and she had lots of problems with addiction, but she was very, very smart. And she helped me unwind some of that, because I'm not a sensitive person. Like, sensitive people, they create music, they do poetry, they write, their feelings come out in paper. My feelings don't come out in paper. This was hard. My feelings I talk things out. And then I go, oh my God, that's it. And so it was when I was in the hospital, and they brought me, so I was in for 3 days, and they let me see her because that was a condition that Catholic hospitals don't let you see your baby. But because I was the only human that I knew that was a relation to me, there was no way I could not see my baby. So I did get to see her for the 3 days. They never brought her to my room. I had, you know, very short bursts of time with her. But the nun brought the papers and left them with me to sign, to review. And my mother had been with me for everything, but I hadn't seen her all day. And I asked the nun, "Where's Mama?" And she said she wanted me to give you a message. She was too emotional to give you this message. She thought she would cry, but she wants you to know that she couldn't live with herself if she were to separate a mother from her child. So if you want to keep your baby, you could bring her home. And then she picked up the papers and left. And I had that moment, like an hour, to make a decision, when I'd been groomed all this time to give up my baby. And then at the last minute, the news was put in my hands. And I thought at the time, oh, that's so kind of my wonderful mother. And it wasn't until I started, when I was really writing through that I realized she threw me under the bus. So that the onus was on me. And that was her survival strategy. That's the best she had. And so in my mind, and this is how the intergenerational trauma happened, is that I never felt worthy of anything. I had such low self-esteem and low self-worth. But my birth mother was good and selfless.
There you go.
And she wanted me to have a mommy and a daddy. So how could I not be like her? And if I were to relinquish my child like she did, I would have the worth that was taken from me when I was relinquished. That was so hard to unwind. It took me almost 8 years. And so that's how. That's how. You know, there's so much that I was able to unwind writing this, and I did stay sober through it, which I had drinking dreams. It was very dark. I put on weight, but on the other side of it, and this is what's insane, is that this girl, and this is a picture of me at 17, I was motherless, and I was trying to start fresh in California. This girl that has this broken, shattered head, I want to protect her now. It's like this came full circle, you know. I've let people treat me poorly and let them back in my life. Like my half-sister, my birth half-sister. And I just realized I have to let go of her. The people that I went to find, and to all those years, because I searched in 1980 through Elma before we had the internet and all that, and found my biological family, and my father, met my father. It's on my website. There's a video because the news team came. But then my birth mother was deceased, and I never got to talk to her and ask her all those things. But all the things that I heard and learned about her, I picked up. All those things, that's low self-worth that she had. And it's interesting, the daughter that I was that I was reunited with in 1991 when she was 18, her second husband was an adoptee, and her current boyfriend's an adoptee. They adopted 2 other girls, and both of them had children out of wedlock, and one relinquished. My daughter did not. And so there's so much intertwining of these roots and entanglement within the adoption constellation. It's affected everybody. In fact, my daughter I got to keep, her name's Becca, she wanted to have a baby. She married a woman, and they went to a cryo bank, and they got a donor. That's my grandson. And it was an anonymous donor. And even though she knows all the searching I did and all the connection I wanted to family, they got an anonymous donor. So unless you've lived this, you're not gonna get it. And my kids, I have 3, none of them have read my book.
Wow.
So there you go.
Let's
Done. Okay.